everybody. Welcome to the biggest event of the week outside of Washington, D.C. Welcome to our Campfire conversation, the first of the year, the third of this series. And tonight, I'm really excited. She's so on time and enthusiastic. Nanjala Nyabola is already with us. Welcome, Nanjala, to Rebel Book Club Campfire Conversation. Great to see you.
Hi, it's good to be seen.
Good to be seen. I know you've got a setup with a different sort of phone and laptop all running in different ways, but it works.
Yeah.
It's working.
Okay. Okay.
You got it. We can see and hear you. That's the main thing. Where are you joining us from tonight?
I'm in Nairobi.
Okay, so you've been there since this craziness kicked off, the global pandemic. So you've been there for a long time. Okay, well, we'll talk about dealing with wanderlust in lockdown once we get going. But for those of you that are joining us tonight, let us know where you're joining from. I can see there's a chat going on there, Nanjala. I don't know if you can see it on your laptop, but there's people saying hello and where they're joining us from, and the fact that some of you have even already dived into this book. So the Campfire Sessions conversations, for those that are joining us tonight, these are our new series of conversations with authors and on topics that we want to get into, we want to connect with, but we haven't had a chance through our main monthly book club. So this is basically like, how can we speak to these people? Let's create an extra event, an extra experience, and here we are. And so a lot of you probably have not come across Nanjala before or read Traveling While Black, but we're going to discover it tonight, which will make, it's a bit like, watching the film before you read the book. You basically going to get a great version, an alternative version of it tonight. And the structure of this is Nanjala and I are going to jump into a conversation in a minute, but there's this chat going live the whole time. You're joining us from Chicago and London and Fatuma and Uganda. Uganda's on the map. Awesome. And Belfast and Richmond, Scotland, LA, Verona, Krakow, Romania, anchors in Romania. Awesome. So we've got a global crew with us tonight, which is great news. But what I thought we'd start with, Nanjala, if you're ready, if you're primed.
I'm ready.
You got your
I'm
hot
ready.
drink there. Always ready.
I do.
Is a quick fire campfire warm-up round. So here we go. Sunrise or sunset?
Sunset.
Mountain or beach?
Mountain.
Even after the dramas that you've had on the mountains?
Even after the drama. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, we have to hear about that. Paperback or ebook?
Paperback.
Oh, you travel with a heavy bag then.
I do.
Audio. I'm sure you do. You have to carry books everywhere. Audio books or podcasts?
Podcasts.
Did you record an audio version of Traveling While Black?
We're working on it.
They're big. 30% of our members listen to the books because they feel like they consume more, and they love to hear the voice of the author. So they are increasingly popular. So look forward to that. Overland adventure or sail the seas?
Overland, for sure.
Yeah, I've done a lot of long bus journeys by the sounds of things. Wildlife safari, Kiswahili word, the original sort of animal adventure, or snorkel scuba dive?
Snorkel.
Aha.
Barely, just barely.
When you live in a country that has some of the best wildlife safaris in the world, you go to the beach. So I learned to dive down in Diani Beach, and it was wild down there. It was a rough sea 20 years ago when I was down there, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Final quick fire, which maybe isn't quick fire. Visa applications or inoculations?
Inoculations.
There you go.
Any day.
Based on your life's experience, it's inoculations any day. It tells you how privileged you are with a passport, right? You say whether you answer that question, inoculations or visa apps. So there's Nanjala, thank you for this. I've consumed this in the last 3 days. It's just takes you in so many different directions, sort of in terms of my own adventurous wanderlust and all around the world, the tour of the world that you take us on, but also emotionally it's uncomfortable. It took me back to when we read Rene Edo Lodge's book, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. It re-challenged my white privilege, which I thought I better understood after that, and the white saviorism of some of my traveling youth. So thank you for the adventure. Thank you for the discomfort and the education. How are you managing your wanderlust in the last year? How have you coped with being physically still?
That's a fantastic question. I guess the short answer is I don't know. It's such a change. It's such a complete dramatic change. And I think what I did very early on in the pandemic is I said to myself that brace yourself for 6 months. Like everybody was saying 3 weeks, 6 weeks. I said, no, no, no. Brace yourself for 6 months, hunker down, get some books, get some, get a plan in place. And now here we are almost 12 months later. And I feel like my sort of resolve is also starting to fray a little bit. I feel like the weird thing that I miss about traveling is airports. and because what I didn't realize was how much the full day on the plane, because usually if I'm traveling to Europe or even West Africa, I have to block the whole day, between driving to the airport and all of that. How much those days were baked into my sense of order, because it's 24 hours, it's 18 hours when I'm offline and I'm inaccessible and I'm able to really have that stillness. And I think that one weird thing that has happened for many of us during this pandemic is that having everything go online has made people assume that we are far more available than we were before. And so perversely, we're actually working more than we were working before. Because you can't just say, well, I can't do that because I'm going to be at the airport, or I can't do that because I'm going to be here, and I can't do that because I have another commitment, because everybody's just at home. And so everybody assumes that if you're at home, then you have time to do the thing that they want you to do. So the strange thing that I've missed is the whole process, not necessarily like going through airport security, which I hate, or going through immigration, which is awful, but the process of being inaccessible and being able to be fully in the moment, sort of going through airports, is the strange thing that I've missed. How am I handling my wanderlust? I'm discovering my hometown. I'm being a tourist in my hometown. The thing with our lockdown here in Nairobi is we have these amazing parks. So for about 6 months, we weren't able to leave or enter the city. And we have these 5, 6 beautiful, huge parks. And I had only really been to like 2, the big national park and the Karura Forest. And the last 9 months, I feel like I've seen more of the city than I had in the previous, however many years. And so forcing myself to see my hometown with new eyes has probably helped me adjust much better to this new reality than I would have otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's wise insight, and a lot of people have been through that. Like, oh, now we're gonna have adventures in our backyard. But this, I mean, you've been to 70 countries, and unlike so many travelers, you've turned so many of those trips, well, they're almost universally purposeful from what I can understand, but so many of them have turned into missions as well, and activism and writing and beyond. So where did this journey start for you? What led you into a life of travel and activism?
I didn't grow up traveling. And I say in the introduction, like I never left, barely left Nairobi until I was in my 20s. And then when I started traveling, I started to encounter a different side to myself, a much more courageous side, a much more open, a side that was much more open to people who had different backgrounds from me, a side that was just much more, I liked this person a lot. And I met someone in myself that I thought, oh my gosh, this is someone that I want to be friends with. This is someone that I want to be. And it just kept opening myself up in new and interesting ways. But I also kept running up against all of these obstacles that I had never thought about before. And I stumbled into the work on refugee protection because I had been such a traveler for so many years. And because I had kept running up against these walls that other people that I was with, so like my first international trip was to go to uni in the UK. And then my first trip within that, I went to the Czech Republic. And for my first summer in uni, I went to the Czech Republic. And I was in a group with other European students, and they were having a hard time understanding why my visa was taking so long to get processed. Because at that time, you know, the UK was not part of it was never part of the Schengen zone. So if you had a UK visa, you still had to apply for a visa to go to mainland Europe. And so all of these, but if you were a European citizen, either of the UK or Western Europe, you could go back and forth without any extra documentation. And so that whole experience was like, people don't really understand how difficult this stuff is, and how difficult it is, especially for people who have passports or who have quote unquote weak passports. And that sort of fed into this idea of, I just had a growing fascination with human mobility and how people move, because I think we take so much of the experiences for granted, and we assume that everybody's, you know, and you see, I've seen it so many times. I'll be in a group and I get pulled out for extra screening, and everybody in the group will be like, oh my gosh, this is so unfair, this never happens. I'm like, it happened to me last month. It happened to me like 2 weeks ago. And so that sort of, I think, especially as travelers who are moving around the world with privilege, we can be so oblivious to how disparate our experiences are, and how there are all of these factors that go into that sort of disparate experience.
Totally. And then, so what was it that you liked about yourself that you discovered? Was it the courage to say, was it discovering this courage or this braveness or this boldness around, actually, a lot of people in this situation would turn around and go, it's too much effort, there's too many barriers in return for what I'm looking for, I'll go home again and make the best of it. But what it was that what you discovered about yourself, that you were like, no, I'm gonna push through, I'm gonna push on?
Yeah, but also that I learned how to enjoy the experience rather than to be always driven by the destination. And sometimes the destination is super interesting and is, you know, even if the experience is really difficult, this destination is super interesting. But really what it was that I went from being a person who had to have everything planned out in triplicate to being a very, like, pick a place in the world, be curious about it, enjoy the experience of getting there, and enjoy experience of being there. And I feel like, as a life lesson, that flexibility, that openness to different places in the world has been a tremendous asset. Because it's just, I've gone from, again, like I said, being a person who had never left their hometown until she was an adult, to being the kind of person who shows up in random places in the world and is just like ready to go, and just slots into new societies and is just ready to go. And but also just in life, I think so many of us inherit, you know, children come into this world and they're so fearless. Kids are so fearless. They're like climbing things and throwing things and whatever. And then we teach them how to be afraid. And we teach them that the world is a scary place, and they start to lose their fear. I think travel can have a way of reteaching us that childlike wonder about the world, if we let it, right? If we allow ourselves and our fears to sort of start to melt away, or we put our fears in our rightful place, travel can just open up the world to us in that way, if we let it, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So let's explore some of these life-changing journeys that you've been on. You open your book with Haiti and your summer there. So tell us a little bit, not too much, because we want people to go away and buy the book to find out the full story. But like, what, how did you end up there, and what happened?
I went to Haiti as part of a summer fellowship, and I went through a process of myself sort of unlearning and repackaging myself and rethinking about who I was and who I wanted to be in the world. That's the short story. That I went into Haiti as a trainee attorney, as a trainee advocate, being encouraged to use and to wield a certain type of power in the space in order to have impact, quote unquote. And I left with a really shifted perspective on what it means to have impact in the world and what it means to work in societies where people have less than you do. I grew to love Haiti in a very, it wasn't an instantaneous thing. It was definitely something that needed time to settle into place. But I grew to love Haiti in a way that I was surprised by, like the intensity of feeling that it drew from me. And I really wanted to start with that essay because I wanted to start with a place that people tend to dismiss because of the stories that are told about it. Often the story of what Haiti is so different from what it actually is. And we forget that people are people. And wherever they are in the world, people are waking up in the morning, they're doing number ones, they're doing number twos, they're taking showers, they're, trying to stay alive, and they're trying to be happy and all of that. And the story of a place can often become so big that we lose sight of the fact that there are people there who live there and every day get up and go through life the same way that we do, even if we have more than, or we think that we have more than they do. And I'll say this about Haiti. I would love for everybody to go to Haiti, even though I know that it's not the easiest place in the world to learn to navigate. It's not the easiest place in the world to be home and present in, but it's really one of the most beautiful. People forget Haiti's in the Caribbean. It's really one of the most beautiful places in the world. It has one of the most richest histories in the world. It has one of the most fascinating histories in the world, and the festivals and I wanted to tell the story of how I learned how to separate the narrative of what a place was from what it actually was.
Yeah, and you do it beautifully with the how you built the relationships with the women you were working with, rather than being segregated off with the international development crowd. And it reminded me of on a much sort of lighter version. I was lucky to spend a year in Sierra Leone, and this was 10 years after the civil war had ended, and it was late. It been put in that box like Haiti has been as well, as civil war, blood diamonds, the RUF. It was this. If you're going to go on holiday somewhere, do not go to Sierra Leone. So we were one of these smattering of sort of groups and social enterprises that were trying to get football academies and ecotourism projects, and we were just lucky to be part of it. And of course, you live on a beach, and your neighbor was part of that civil war, and you, like anywhere in the world, you learn very quickly that everyone's just getting on with their lives. And the great thing about Salone that I experienced was this desire to celebrate everything all the time. And I don't know how much of that was long history and culture, and how much of it was immediate sort of recovery and just enjoying the freedom and so on. So the beach parties were awesome in Salone.
The carnival in Haiti was one of the wildest, most amazing parties that I've ever been to. And there's a moment when the carnival was happening, and I had snuck in because it's one of those things that they discourage foreigners from doing because it's not safe and whatever. And I was like, well, I'd been pushing my boundaries every week. And so this was like the next step. And you're in the stands, and there's bands and there's acrobats, and then the president rolls in on a golf cart and he's dancing, and you're like, what is this? What is happening here? It was honestly one of the wildest parties that I've ever been. And one of the best. Then there was a hurricane or storm, a tropical storm, and the rain was pelting, and we just danced in the rain for however long it took. It was amazing.
It's like they call it Juve in Trinidad. It starts at 12 at midnight, and you're kind of going, hold on a second. It starts at midnight, and everyone's out, and then it goes through the night, and all the police are dancing away, and you're like, gosh, this is And I was like, don't go to Port of Spain. It's real security issues. Well, there may be a lot of the year, but right now Anyway,
Yeah.
Ava in the chat is saying, dying to travel to Haiti. My mum was Haitian and the beaches, cultures look amazing. Ava, you got to go. Heritage there. So moving on, we've got, so the other thing that I was impressed and inspired by your stories was that you had, because of the prejudice and the racism built into the ability to move around this world, you know, you seem to be particularly good at seizing moments of freedom within a visa, like a compressed visa structure. So you were in the Schengen zone between conferences, and you had a few days, and you took yourself down to Sicily, to the front line of the refugee crisis. And I think I started to read this. I'm like, why in her moment of like freedom is she like taking herself to one of the crisis points in the world? So why did you do it, and what did you discover?
You know, like I say in the book, I wish I had a simple answer, but what I just had been feeling was this pressure to see for myself and to be able to articulate it back to an African audience and also to a European audience, as someone who sort of moves between the two continents with a little bit more freedom than most. And I felt that the story that was coming out wasn't really like European audiences consuming European media were getting one version of the story, and African audiences consuming African audience were barely getting in a story because African journalists couldn't get into Europe to do stories about the migration crisis. So everything that we were getting was, you know, COP was what do they call them? Wire services, it's AFP, it's Reuters and what have you. So I felt like there was a gap in the story, and I felt like I had the technical skills both as a writer and as a person who was able to move between these worlds to try and tell that story. And I went because, yeah, I think that was the pressure that was there. And I had been in and out of Europe for probably at that point 6 or 7, maybe more than actually, about 10 years. And so I had seen all of the Eiffel Towers and the museums and the what have you. And what I really was what had happened actually was I had been invited, because I already had a law degree at this particular point and a degree in refugee studies. I had been invited by a friend of mine who was volunteering, an American friend who was volunteering in Greece, to come and join their program and do pro bono representation of African refugees arriving and Middle Eastern refugees arriving in Greece. And we tried twice, and both times the organization said, look, I don't think I can get you a visa because you need a Schengen visa and they're not going to let you work on a tourist visa. And technically this is work. So you can't volunteer on this project. And I was like, so then basically you're saying to me that you need me, not you need me, but you feel like I can bring something to the table. And because of this technicality, you're not even going to let me try. And it's not the first time it had happened, right? It had happened, you know, before with different opportunities, trying to get professional experience in refugee practice. And so it was a combination of those things that I just wanted to tell this story as a person who had the technical and the human sort of experience to be able to add a specific lens to it. Yeah.
And you certainly did. And you met the local mayor, who sounded like a huge advocate for you know, essentially helping these people arrive into Italy versus what was the instructions coming down from Rome and Brussels. What did you you know, what did you go away from that, seeing that crisis firsthand, seeing as you described it, like it almost felt like a slave ship arriving there in Sicily?
I think that, you know, do you remember the other day in the UK there was that Sky News boat that was chasing down 14 people in a dinghy? I feel like European media sometimes trivializes the depth of human suffering that drives someone to wake up and walk across the desert and risk their life trying to get safe. I think that we've become, as a society, so desensitized to, you know, what Warsan Shira calls when home is the mouth of a shark, that these are not joyrides. These are not things that are easy. And so I think that was part of it was that I had felt like there was a slight trivialization of what was happening. I didn't expect to be as deeply affected as I was. Again, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I have the professional experience, I've traveled. I didn't expect to feel like I was being punched in the stomach when the boat arrived and the people started to come off the boat. And there's this thing about looking at people who you can sort of see in another world yourself being one circumstance, two circumstances removed from that same scenario. You know, these are people who, we don't get a lot of that north-south movement from Kenya, but, you know, people from Sudan, people from Ethiopia, people from Eritrea are some of the biggest groups of people who make that trip. And, you know, we have a lot of Ethiopians here in Nairobi. We have a lot of Eritreans. We have a lot of Sudanese people. So seeing that firsthand was a deeply it was a difficult thing to see. But then also, you know, Palermo really surprised me. Like you mentioned the mayor, but also like this anarchist collective that when they found out that what I was up to in terms of this witnessing, they were like, oh, you have to come to our meeting. And they were organizing to protest the restrictions that were coming from Rome. And I didn't speak a word of Italian except, you know, spaghetti, lasagna, meatballs. And they didn't speak a word, yeah, keywords. And they didn't speak a word of English. And we were in this meeting and they were trying to get me to understand that, you know, these guys think they represent all of us and they really don't. And seeing sort of the young volunteers on the boats as well. And I feel like that's, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie writes about the danger of a single story. And I feel like Europeans who don't feel represented by this increasingly right-wing rhetoric against refugees and migrants need to reclaim the story, because the single story that's coming out of this is one, what the mayor of Palermo said, I think 50 years from now, Europe is going to be tried for crimes against humanity for what they're doing to people in the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that's very true. And so if you are a person who thinks that this whole situation needs to be addressed in a much more humane, that rich countries shouldn't be allowing people to die just because they happen to be Arab, just because they happen to be African. Like that's really what it comes down to, is a collective decision to say, we're gonna withdraw help from these boats because we don't want these people here. That's the apogee of racism. And I feel like if you are a person of conscience, you need to speak up in this conversation, because the single story is just damning the entire continent to a really bad place in history.
Yeah, and it's just all these fears colliding in one place, isn't it? And some of them are much more justified. We had an amazing, your voice on this reminds me of a conversation we had in October last year with Dina Nayeri, who wrote the book about her life and the refugee crisis, or The Ungrateful Refugee. And I just, as you were talking, grabbed the link, so I'll share that here, but it's with our conversation with her. And at the end of the conversation, I said to Dina, so okay, let's say you're in charge of policy in Europe on the refugee crisis. What do we do? And she was like, boom, and basically hit this through this manifesto. These are all the policy changes I would make tomorrow. This is how we do it. Had the whole plan. I was like, Dina, where do we vote for you? Like, you've got to do this. She's like, oh, it's a long journey to that. I said, come on. So it's there's a lot of fantastic leaders like you and Dina out there on this crisis. And we also spoke with a couple of the NGOs working on the front line in Greece. There's one called Secondary, and about the reality of what's going on, and of course during COVID, how much worse it's getting, and so on. So yeah, we need to be constantly reminded of this crisis and the human story. So thank you for bringing it back to our attention. Now moving back to Africa. You take a trip to the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and remind us of what our smartphones are made of. And tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah. So I have been going to the DRC for work, different pieces of work for about 5 years. And there was, like I say in the book, there is no country, I think, in the world that has ever intimidated me as much as the DRC. Firstly, because the entire country is about the size of Western Europe. So it is the second.
Yeah.
largest country in Africa. I think Algeria is slightly bigger. It takes 5 hours to fly from one end to the other, nonstop. Like it takes 5 hours to fly from one end to the other.
Wow.
And it has one of the most fascinating histories, because the DRC is one of those places that has never, the first prime minister of the DRC served for 2 months and was assassinated, Patrice Lumumba. In fact, Lumumba Day is January 17th, so it was this Sunday. So the colonial rule, the Belgian colonial rule in the DRC was some of the most brutal. I mean, colonization itself is very brutal, but the Belgian colonization was particularly brutal because it was being run as a private enterprise of the King of Belgium. And so like, chop people's hands off for failing to tap enough rubber, and they would kill kids in front of their parents if they failed to, harvest enough tobacco. It was incredibly brutal. And a lot of Europeans don't learn this history, especially because that King of Belgium is the current King of Belgium's grandfather. And so everything about the DRC, the politics, is always framed as what might have been, what could have been if this hadn't happened, if that hadn't happened, if that hadn't happened, if that hadn't happened. And so it's an intimidating place to be, because you want to be able to process what's in front of you, not what exists in an alternate reality. But I think the what's in front of you is complicated by what people think could have been different. And so much of our prosperity comes from the soils of the DRC. And the one that I talk about in that essay is the coltan that goes into our semiconductors, that goes into our electronics. And as a person who was on one hand trying to do human rights advocacy in the DRC, and on the other hand, who, just like anybody else, likes stuff. I like stuff. I think, stuff can be good. I had gotten to a point where these things were pulling apart in a really difficult way, because this isn't in the book, but one of the things that happened, for example, when I was doing human rights training in Eastern DRC, is someone came up to me and said, we work for a human rights organization, we receive all this video of crimes being committed, international crimes being committed, and we don't know what to do with it. What do you think we should do with it? I said, well, what kind of videos? Like, it depends on what the video is. And I said, well, I'll show you one. And for example, one thing that happens in some of these coltan mines is sexual assault of women to make sure that they're not stealing coltan in their vaginas. And so every day they go out, and before they leave, they get searched. But essentially it's sexual assault every day, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I couldn't look at my phone the same way again. Coltan is an essential element of semiconductors. All phones need it. The DRC's, I think, the largest. I think it's dropped back now because of weird statistical complications, but Australia also produces, but for a long time it was the largest producer of coltan in the world. How do you reconcile those two things? And I don't know the answer. That's where I left it in the essay. It's like, I really don't know the answer. I really don't.
Like, come on, Nanjala, give me the simple answer. I'm just a basic consumer with like a little conscience here. No, it's and it's not that you're not the first person to tell that story, but the message isn't getting through, or at least there's not enough pressure reaching to. We're seeing it in some industries, aren't we? But not in the smartphone industry, because we're all addicted to these. The next model.
Exactly,
yeah, the business model's broken from a social point of view. But one area that is one product that is out there is what is called the Fairphone. It's a Dutch company, and they're onto. I had their Model 2, which wasn't great, but the idea, but it's gone on a lot since then. But the idea is that all the components are interchangeable. So, in other words, it doesn't just you don't just have to keep upgrading. You just replace components. I don't know what its relationship it is with cobalt and other minerals like that, but it is a really interesting brand. So I'd encourage anyone who's interested in the future of those kind of electronics, look up Fairphone, and there will be lots more companies like that soon. And if there aren't, start them. So you mentioned it actually at the end of this chapter in terms of a mindset rather than go buy a Fairphone, but it's the mindset we need. You mentioned one of your heroes, and someone that I came across years ago when I was traveling in East Africa, which is Wangari Maathai, who started the Greenbelt movement, and sadly no longer with us, but really one of the great environmental and social leaders in the world in the last generation. And you talk about this key lesson of like everyday activism that she sort of inspired, obviously, in millions of women in sub-Saharan Africa. What does that mean for you, like, and how do you try and apply it?
I think that it comes down to live your life as if your choices matter. Live your life as if your choices matter for the world. And that means to not take choices lightly. And where there's a fork between doing something that might make someone's life better and doing something that, or someone else's life better, and doing something that only benefits you, to try and do things that make someone else's life better. I think that for me, it comes down to, for example, conscious consumption, that don't waste things. Since that's one of the so like I spent a couple of weeks last year writing about plastic waste and writing about what happens to plastic waste. And there's an essay out there in a magazine, a British magazine actually, I wrote about plastic waste and where people think plastic waste goes versus where it actually goes. And again, it's the same thing. Like, the system is broken from the beginning. Plastic waste, most of what you think is being recycled is being dumped in poor countries. And so the only thing that you can really do, the most important thing that you can really do at this end, is consume less plastic. Just use less. Just figure out a way to eliminate single-use plastic from your life. And it's inconvenient. Like, who, every so often you walk in the single-use plastic, if you go to a pharmacy or a supermarket, is £1 versus the reusable bottle, which is £3 or £4, and then you have to fill it, and then you have to. But the fundamental thing is this: there is a cost to everything, and you either pay that cost in money, or you pay it in the future of the world, like the state of the world and the future of the world. So whatever you think that you're saving in money is being converted into a cost to the world. And so the more of us move towards this principle of conscious consumption, that fine, we live in the world, and yeah, we like stuff, and yeah, we like to be in the world, but just knowing that that in itself will have knock-on effects and trying to reduce those knock-on effects, I think if enough people do it, then we start to see a difference. And this is something that Howard Zinn, who's one of my favorite writers, says, a critical mass of critical engaged people doing the right thing can transform the world. The problem is that we're not getting to critical mass, and that's why things keep getting worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and we just have to focus on where the positive momentum is building, and it is building. And in so many places, I was even talking with someone who founded an organization called Plastic Planet this morning, and Sian Sutherland, and it's incredible what they're doing there, all these campaigns and all these technologies. She was telling me about all these different natural technologies around packaging that exist already, a bit like, renewable energy. That it's here. It just needs the investment and the political will and everything, and the stories to be told, like we're doing right now. Now, you mentioned a reusable water bottle. That just links perfectly to the near life death experience that you had on the slopes of a little hill in the Himalayas called Everest. In Nepal. So if you're happy to go back there, tell us why did you go to Everest, and what happened?
I think anybody who travels, well, not anybody. I think a lot of us who travel, especially those of us who are backpackers, there is this constant search for the next high, right? The next thrill, the next challenge, the next thing that you can conquer. And so I had done Kilimanjaro and I had done Mount Kenya. Those are the two highest peaks in Africa. And I was like, well, then what's the next challenge? What's the next thing that we can climb? And it turns out that getting to Everest Base Camp is actually easier than getting to the summit of a lot of lower mountains. So for example, it's easier to get to on paper, this is what they say. It's easier
Yeah.
to get to Everest Base Camp than getting to the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro or Mount Kenya. So I thought,
And then
okay,
Kilimanjaro
let's do that.
and Everest Base Camp are the same altitude, pretty much, aren't they?
Kilimanjaro is 5.898. Everest Base Camp is 5.3. So Everest Base Camp is lower. It's 5.34 something. Yeah. So it's lower. The thing is, when I tell the story, one of the reasons why I tell that story in the way that I do is because I don't want people to read that essay and think, oh my gosh, Nepal is awful. Because Nepal wasn't awful. I just had an awful experience in Nepal. And I think that for people who travel, it's important for us to make those distinctions. There are distinctions between things, like when I talk about the visa bureaucracies, that's built into the system. That exclusion, that whatever is built into the system. And there's a difference between that and going to a place where it's not necessarily built into the system in the same way, but it's something that the circumstances make possible. I feel like I went to Nepal because it just seemed like the next logical thing to do. And I didn't expect it to be such a dramatic moment in my life. I just expected it to be just another trip, like any other. I was working the day before I got on the plane, and I was scheduled to work when I came back after it. I didn't expect it to be that dramatic. And it turned out to be really one of the most dramatic experiences that I've ever been through in my life.
Yeah, and just we won't tell the full story, but yeah, basically racism built into the leadership of the team and led to you becoming seriously dehydrated at altitude, and yeah, I mean near death experience. So thank God you came through it. And yeah, it's one of those things as a white privileged traveler, you just you instinctively overlook, because you're like, well, why would you ever get into that situation? You can't imagine getting to that situation, but it happened, and it happened to you. So it's a really important story to share.
Yeah. And I can tell you on that score that the people that I was in the group with, some of them were like the guy that I mentioned in the book that I had to keep asking to help me, horrified. And it was so palpable. It was so clearly that I was getting an inferior experience from everybody else in the group. And the guide not getting that his, I shouldn't swear, behavior was putting our lives at risk, putting my life at risk. And I think that, like you said, a lot of people don't realize these things until it's happening right in front of them. And until it's actually the risk is the person's experience is right in front of them. So I hope that by telling that story, that people can realize that it really can be that small, but it builds up into something that is life or death. It really can be that small moment when a police officer decides that a 12-year-old kid carrying a water pistol is a threat, or a person on a tube, like it's those small minuscule judgments that can spiral out of control.
Yeah, and there's no bigger example than what we saw in Washington last week. The difference between that and the BLM protests and the response to it. It's so blatant. And so in the world of travel, and by the way, for everyone who's closely following this, thank you. And I'm not surprised you're super engaged listening to Nanjala's storytelling. But if any of you would like to jump on for a few minutes, we've got about 15, 20 more minutes. We can keep going as long as Nanjala doesn't have another something else to rush to. Welcome to join us on stage. What do we do about this? Like from a position of privilege, assuming we go back to the world of be it free movement or free to a certain degree, how do we make it better? How do we make it less racist? How do we make it fairer? What can we do as individuals?
I think we can be honest about the things that we have that are denied to other people on the basis of their identity. And that's one of the things that I try to do throughout the book. Is I try to be honest, because even within the world of, there's our identities are so many different things. So I am Black, I am African, I'm also middle class. And that brings a certain amount of privilege that, for example, the people that I was witnessing in Palermo will not go through the airport, for example, the same experience that I had. So I think we start by being honest about the fact that a lot of us have things that other people don't have. and that we have to wield that privilege responsibly and respectfully, and cede it, and actually just like really cede it to someone else if it will benefit them. I think we have to be honest about the fact that there's so much injustice built into the world of travel, and we have to push back against that. And it's not, we shouldn't just take our government's word for it that they're building systems with our security in mind, but we should constantly keep asking questions about, well, who do you think is the threat here? And like you mentioned what happened in Washington last week, and I was talking to some friends of mine, and I said, it means something that African and Asian kids have been killed for playing too close to military bases, American military bases, in poor countries. But the most meaningful, or the most, complete threat to power in the United States came through a white nationalist group, because it tells you something that is built into the logic of national security about who the enemy is. Can you imagine a world in which Black people, Arab people would even get close to the Capitol building? Like, I went to the White House a couple of years ago, and like, you can't even get that close unless you're like on a scheduled tour and you've been checked and you're being brought in by, a congresswoman or whatever. So those are the kind of sneaky little logics that we have to start really thinking about and reading up and read for. That's why we put a further reading list at the end of the book. And that doesn't mean that if you read those books, you'll understand everything. But read books that make you uncomfortable, and listen to the stories of people whose lives are different from yours, and learn from them, and see, and like, as a traveler, one of the things that I do when I go to a foreign country is I try to get a book from that country, usually a novel, sometimes a nonfiction. If there's no novels that are readily handy, then I take a nonfiction book. Read. I'm trying to remember this correctly. It is important for us to read outside the lines that we have drawn in our lives. It's important for us. Reading is really easy way for us to immerse ourselves into the experiences of people whose lives are different from ours, and to start to see the world with a much more holistic empathy than if we just spend our lives engaging with people who have had similar life, similar background, similar experiences from us. And that's sorry, it's a rambling answer, but when I write in the Bessie Head essay about how that reading experiment that I did completely changed my life, I'm not being hyperbolic. Like, you can see the details, you can read, I've written about it elsewhere as well. Learn how to read outside the lines that you've drawn into your life, as just a starting point of acknowledging that this stuff matters.
I'm going to watch back that section of this. I'm going to watch back the whole conversation, Nanjala. But that section, I'm just going to like write down and put on our about page of Rebel Book Club, because even the rambling bits. No. Well, credited to you, of course. But it's funny because we're two white privileged travelers who started this club 5 years ago. But we started it, because we want to improve our reading habits, but also we were like, we want to read stuff that takes us out of our comfort zones, and we need motivation, accountability, and guidance for that. And we've, as this brilliant community has formed, and it's middle class and privileged, right? But it's diverse. It's certainly in our London community where we've been based for the first few years, and now as we go globally. And it's great because we're constantly pushing ourselves, and we're now, making a much more conscious effort to have authors who wouldn't be as easily represented, through the infrastructure of the publishing industry, which has its biases, as you know. And it's great because the most is what's great about the experience we've had, and your book's perfect for this, is that the books that kind of like the majority of us would not pick off the shelf, because you're drawn to the things that you're familiar with, right? You're drawn to them. And so if you go, whereas now books like yours are more familiar to me, because I'm like, this looks like a Rebel Book Club book, because it looks like it will challenge and educate and inspire. So that really resonates with what we're doing. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for your book. It's a really important book. I can relate to everything that you have stated today. I myself, I was raised in Norway, and I'm born in Canada, live in the UK. So I've traveled a lot, and I definitely can relate to the discrimination that is faced by many Black people that travel around the world. And that's something that I actually wanted to work for. I have a background in law, and I always saw how a lot of Black people were discriminated on airports, etc. So that's definitely something that I would want to work with. And thank you so much again for talking about the Congo. I have a great passion for the Congo, as yourself, and I'm so glad that someone from Kenya has a heart for the Congo. The Congo has suffered for so long, and it's so important that we work together to make change. And so many people have suffered for too long. So I wrote in the chat that if you're interested, I'm working on a series of talks to bring more awareness about the UN mapping report that was written in 2010, that highlights the gravest human rights abuses in the Congo between 1993 to 2003. So our first talk is scheduled end of January, and the 30th of January, we will have a human rights lawyer join us who actually worked on the report. And it would be great to have you along too, and future talks. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Anyone else? We've got probably time for one or two more to join us, if they can make it up onto this stage, which takes a little bit of coordination. What I wanted to ask on this, hopefully this pandemic well, first of all, how do you see a way out of this pandemic in terms of the inequality that even we're seeing with the vaccination program coming now? Because it both practically and in terms of inequality, it seems like a lot of people don't understand that unless everyone gets this, we can't get through to the other side. And then what if and when we do, collectively, where are you going?
So the first question, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. Either we all make it through this pandemic or none of us will make it through this pandemic. You need 70% of people in the world to be vaccinated in order to have herd immunity. But countries like Canada has bought 5 times enough vaccine for its population 5 times over. And in the Central African the head of the World Health Organization was saying today that there are countries in Africa where 25 people, not 2,500, not 25,000, 25 people have received the vaccine. So Africa is the second most populous continent in the world. So if African countries are being edged out of the vaccine, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You'll not get to global herd immunity. The pandemic will spin out of control. So you absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think it's been a real test of global solidarity, and I think that we're failing. I think that countries are failing. I think the international system is failing. And that's kind of what everybody needs to be. And we need to push our governments, and we need to push our international organizations to just remember that we're either all going to make it or no one's going to make it. The funny story for my end, it's not funny, haha, it's funny, weird. This was the year that I was going to go to Antarctica.
Okay.
And so, that's the first place that I'll go. Just because it's there and because it fascinates. I love deserts. I love cold deserts. I love hot deserts. I love places where weird animals are just kind of surviving and building these weird lives that are so different from places where everything is lush and green and things like that. And maybe it's because I grew up in a country where mosquitoes are a big problem, but I love deserts also because there are never any mosquitoes and you can sleep, you can be sort of comfortable in that. So yeah, that's,
I hope you make it. I hope you make it
yeah.
to Antarctica, because that would be an amazing trip. And you just reminded me, one of the best night's sleep I've ever had, certainly outdoors, was on the roof of a house on the edge of the Sahara in Mali, and the Dogon region. There are these big the Bandiagara escarpment, which runs for sort of 300 kilometers, and a remarkable place that you don't ever really want to tell anyone because it's so special. But yeah, you sleep out, but the breeze, it's the breeze. So you get this lovely breeze coming down because of the cliffs, and as a result, there's no mosquitoes, and you're looking at like what feels like half the universe. And that's what's so perfect. And Sam, just to build on that, Sam is asking, where in the world have you felt most welcomed?
I wrote about it, Burkina Faso, and it's part of the reason why it breaks my heart. Honestly, I felt more at home in Burkina Faso than I did in my own home country.
Wow.
And I think it's partly because there is no country in the world that lives up more to its name than Burkina Faso, which means the land of honest men, or the land of upright people. I felt tremendous. It might also have been because it was the first time that I had traveled solo with no plan, that it was just like, it's there and I have time and I have money and I'm gonna go. So it might have been that it was just this growing moment for me, and that's why it's always held a really special place in my heart. But I felt so, and I felt so welcome, and I felt that I've been singing this praise song. When was I in Burkina Faso? 2007. I've been singing that praise song since then. I especially want more Africans to travel more to other African countries as backpackers, as people who are looking for that non-resort experience, because so much of what we think we know about our neighbors and other places in the world is shaped by media that has a different interest from telling the complete story. And Burkina Faso is one of those places that everybody ignored until there was a war. And so it's very easy to think that it's always been the way it is now. But when I tell you, was always one of the most, and you've been to Mali, so you know that Sahel region, how amazing the culture is, and the idea of welcome, leaving a pot of water outside your house so that people who are walking, in case they get hot, they can have drinking water. Can you imagine being able to walk through the streets of London and every house has like a place outside where you can get a quick cup of water, just because the idea of a traveler passing out of dehydration or whatever is so antithetical to the culture. Things like that. I felt so welcome, and I felt so embraced. I never paid for food until I was like on the road. It breaks my heart to see what's happening in Burkina Faso right now. And it breaks my heart because I think it's all so unnecessary, and we're really losing one of the most amazing places in the world to short-sighted geopolitics.
It's wonderful to hear it. 'Cause I was so lucky to travel in that part of the world and go. I drove from Accra, and I thought the hospitality in Ghana was great, and then I went over the border and got to Ouagadougou, and I drank pina coladas and played crazy golf, and then went out to a Fela Kuti inspired concert outdoors that night, and the fresh bread in the morning, and they even had milk. I was like, we didn't have this in Ghana. So yeah, I for different reasons maybe, but that's the same sort of impact Burkina had on me. In fact, I loved it so much that when my second daughter was born, I was like, I want to build something of that part of the world, even though she's English parents but I couldn't call an English girl Ouagadougou, so we called her, so she's called Mali instead, which worked out.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it worked out. We love that name for her. But Nanjala, I really hope I meet you on a bus somewhere in the world, or up a mountain, or in the desert, because you're the perfect travel company when we're stuck in lockdown, but also you're the perfect company for activism and change. So
thank you.
Yeah, your book is going to be bought by a lot of people tonight, and hopefully you can come back to Rebel Book Club again. And thank you for your time, and thanks to everyone for being with us. We will share a roundup of tonight, the video and the edit and the learnings and the book links and everything in the next few days.
Thank you. This is a fantastic platform. I'm really happy to be here.
It's our pleasure, Nanjala. Take care for the rest of lockdown and good luck with your next trip.
You too.
To the ice.
You too.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.